Welcome to Grow Yourself Great. Before you can understand the pattern, you have to understand the psychology that built it. Today, I want to challenge one of the most common beliefs people have about relationships. People say, I have a type. I always attract the same people. I don't know why I keep ending up here. I don't believe any of those statements are asking the deepest question. I think they're describing the ending while completely missing the beginning. Because if you misunderstand where relationship actually begins, you'll spend the rest of your life trying to solve the wrong problem. And if you solve the wrong problem, the pattern survives. Today, I don't want to teach you how to choose better people. I want to expose the psychological process that quietly influences who captures your attention, who keeps your attention, and why someone can begin changing your life before you consciously understand why. Because I don't think most people have ever been taught what attraction actually is. And once you understand it, you may never experience another relationship the same way again. Let me ask you something. How many people have you walked past in your life? Thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions. Now think about something remarkable. Out of all of those people, only a handful ever became emotionally significant. Why? Really think about that. If attraction was simply about beauty, why haven't you fallen for every beautiful person you've ever seen? If attraction was simply about intelligence, why haven't you become attached to every intelligent person you ever met? If attraction was simply about kindness, why have some of the kindest people you've ever known remain nothing more than acquaintances? While someone who eventually hurt you felt impossible to ignore. Something else is happening. Now, let me slow the moment down. You walk into a room. Nothing feels different. People are talking, laughing, moving around. Then your eyes stop. Not because you consciously told them to. They just do. Someone caught your attention. You haven't spoken. You don't know their values. You don't know their character. You don't know how they treat people when they're frustrated. You don't know whether they can love. You don't know whether they can tell the truth. You know almost nothing. Yet something inside you says, pay attention. What exactly just happened? Most people answer, I don't know. They're just my type. But think about that answer. Did you actually explain anything? Or did you simply give the experience a name? Imagine walking into a museum. Out of hundreds of paintings, one stops you. Another person walks past the exact same painting without slowing down. Was the painting objectively more important, or did something about that painting resonate with something already existing inside you? That question changes everything. Because what if people don't become significant simply because of who they are? What if they become significant because of what they awaken? That's a very different way of understanding attraction. Most people believe they're choosing people. I don't think that's where the process begins. I think something inside them is recognizing something meaningful long before they consciously explain it. And that's why I don't believe you have a type. I believe you have a psychological map. And every time someone matches enough of that map, your attention changes, your emotions change, your thinking changes. Eventually, your behavior changes. Not because you decided to fall for them, because something meaningful had already begun happening inside you. Here's the danger. When you don't understand the process, you invent explanations. Chemistry, a spark, a vibe, fate, destiny, soulmates. Those words describe the experience. They do not explain the mechanism. And if you cannot explain the mechanism, you cannot intentionally influence it. You keep saying, I don't know why this keeps happening. Not because there isn't an answer, but because you've been standing at the end of the process, trying to explain a beginning you never witnessed. That is where repeated relationship patterns are born. Not because you consciously choose the wrong person, because you never consciously understood what first captured you. And what remains unconscious often repeats itself. Stop asking, why do I keep falling for the same people? Start asking, what keeps becoming psychologically significant to me? Because you may not have a type, you may have a match. Now, I want to challenge you even more. I don't think your relationship began the day you met them. I think that's the day you became aware of it. There's a difference. Imagine two children. Both hear the words, I'm proud of you. The first child hears those words almost every day. The words feel warm, encouraging, loving. The second child rarely hears those words. When they finally do, they feel extraordinary. The exact same sentence creates two completely different emotional experiences. Why? The words were identical. The speaker may have even meant the same thing. So what changed? The answer isn't outside the children. It's inside them. One child developed in an environment where encouragement became familiar. The other developed in an environment where encouragement carried tremendous psychological weight. The experience didn't begin with the sentence. The sentence landed on years of development. Now, follow that child into adulthood. Someone notices their effort, encourages them, believes in them. Suddenly, they can't stop thinking about that person. Why? Was it because encouragement is magical? No. The present moment touched an organized history. The adult believes they're responding to what happened today. In reality, today's experience awakened meanings that have been quietly developing for years. This is one of the greatest misunderstandings in relationship psychology. People believe they're responding only to the present. They're often responding to the present through the organization of their past. That doesn't mean your childhood determines your future. It doesn't. Development is not destiny, but development matters because your brain has been learning from the day you entered this world. Every disappointment, every success, every rejection, every goodbye, every embrace, every celebration. Your brain wasn't just storing memories. It was asking questions. Who keeps me safe? What earns attention? What creates attention? When do I matter? Who notices me? What must I become to keep this feeling? Children rarely ask those questions out loud. Their brains answer them through experience. Experience becomes meaning. Meaning becomes organization. Organization becomes expectation. Expectation quietly becomes the map through which they begin interpreting the world. Which means, long before you ever met the person you now say changed your life, your psychology had already spent years deciding what experiences would carry the greatest emotional weight. The person didn't arrive to an empty system. They entered one that had already been learning, one that had already been adapting, one that had already been organizing itself around what it believed was necessary to survive, to belong, to matter. Now ask yourself a different question. When that person entered your life, were they creating something entirely new, or were they awakening something that had been waiting to be recognized? Because those are two very different psychological events. The person may have been new. The psychological meaning they awakened may have been years in the making. I want you to imagine something, not because it's a metaphor, because I think it's been happening your entire life. Do you remember the game Concentration? Cards are placed down on a table or floor, one by one. You turn them over. You aren't looking for every card. You're looking for one thing, a match. You flip over a card, not a match, you keep searching. Another card, not a match, then suddenly, there it is. The moment two cards fit together, everything changes. Your attention changes. Your strategy changes. Your behavior changes. Not because the game changed, because something meaningful had been recognized. Now, let me ask you something. What if human beings have been playing a psychological version of that game every day of their lives? Not with cards, with experiences, with conversations, with opportunities, with relationships. Think about yesterday. How many things happened around you that you never even noticed? Hundreds, thousands. People walked by, someone smiled, someone laughed, someone looked in your direction, someone complimented another person, someone shared a story, someone asked a question. Most of it disappeared before you consciously registered it. Then one moment didn't. One sentence, one look, one conversation, one person. Out of everything your brain encountered that day, something remained. Why? Did the moment decide to become more important? Or did something inside you decide without your awareness that it mattered? That question changes the entire discussion. Because if your psychology is constantly sorting through experience, then attention isn't random. Attention is selective. And selection always tells us something, not only about what we are looking at, but about the person doing the looking. Think about two people walking through the same bookstore. One immediately notices the business section. Another never even walks near it. One stops at books about parenting. Another goes directly to history. The book didn't choose the reader. The reader's interest organized what became significant. Now move that same principle into relationships. Two people meet the exact same individual. One says they seem nice. The other can't stop thinking about them. Same person, different experience. Why? Most people answer chemistry. I'm going to ask a more useful question. What was matched? Because I don't believe your psychology is searching for people first. I believe it's searching for matches. And every time a meaningful match occurs, your internal world reorganizes around it. That doesn't make the match unhealthy. It doesn't make it healthy either. It simply means something important has been recognized. Now, here's where people usually make their first mistake. They believe the person created the experience. But imagine playing Concentration. When you find a matching card, did the second card create the first one? Of course not. The first card was already there. The second card revealed it. I think people do the same thing psychologically. Someone enters your life. They don't create every important emotional experience inside you. They reveal places that were already there. Needs, desires, longings, questions, hopes, old conclusions, old adaptations, old meanings. The person becomes the second card. They don't manufacture your psychology. They expose it. That's why one person can walk into your life and awaken hope, while another awakens fear, another awakens confidence, another awakens insecurity. The person didn't necessarily place those experiences inside you. They matched places where those experiences were already organized. Now let me show you why this matters. Suppose I asked you, what are you looking for in a relationship? Most people answer with qualities: kind, honest, funny, attractive, emotionally available. Those are descriptions. They still don't explain why one honest person captures you, while another honest person doesn't. Something deeper is organizing your attention. Something deeper is deciding what becomes psychologically significant. And until you understand that, you'll continue explaining your life by what you noticed instead of investigating why you noticed it in the first place. That's where awareness begins, not with the person, with yourself. The question isn't who caught my attention. The deeper question is, what inside me made this person psychologically significant? Because people don't become emotionally important simply by appearing. They become important when they match something your psychology has already been searching for. Now we can finally answer the question. If your psychology is searching for matches, what exactly is it trying to match? Not people, not personalities, not relationship status. Something much deeper. Human drivers. And before I define a human driver, I want you to experience one. Imagine you had not eaten in 2 days. You walk into a room. On one side of the room, someone is giving a brilliant lecture, like me. I'm giving a brilliant lecture. On the other side, someone places a hot meal on the table. Where does your attention go? Most people smile and say, the food? Exactly. Did you consciously decide to value food more than knowledge? Or did something biologically immediately organize your attention? Hunger is a driver. Now imagine something different. You haven't spoken to another human being in months. You feel profoundly alone. You walk into another room. Someone walks over, looks you in the eyes, smiles, says, I've been hoping to talk with you. Now what happened? The words themselves weren't extraordinary. But under those conditions, they become emotionally significant. Why? Because another human driver was just touched. Connection. The driver organized your attention before your conscious mind finished interpreting the sentence. Now imagine a child. The child brings home a drawing. A parent smiles, hangs it on the refrigerator, says, I'm proud of you. The child smiles, not because refrigerators are magical, not because paper is magical, because another driver has just been met. Recognition, significance, being seen. Now imagine the same child repeatedly learning, I only feel seen when I perform. Years pass. The child becomes an adult. Someone admires their work, compliments their intelligence, celebrates their accomplishments. Something inside them comes alive. Did the adult suddenly become needy? No. The present moment touched a developmental organization that had been quietly shaping attention for years. This is why understanding human drivers changes everything. A human driver is not simply something you want. It is a want, a need, or a desire that organizes your attention, your emotions, your thinking, and your behavior toward obtaining a psychological, biological, or physical outcome. Every human being has them, every single one. The question isn't whether you have drivers. The question is, do you know what yours are? Because what you do not consciously know can quietly organize the direction of your life. And that is where we're going next. I want you to consider something. If I told you there has never been a single day of your life where a human driver wasn't influencing your attention, not one. Think about your morning. Why did you eat what you ate? Why did you ignore one email and immediately respond to another? Why did one social media post make you stop scrolling while hundreds of others disappeared without a second thought? Most people believe they simply made choices. I think something happened before the choice. Let's slow the process down. Imagine you're walking through a shopping mall. You aren't looking for shoes. You aren't looking for a watch. You're simply walking. Then suddenly you stop. A store window caught your attention. Now here's the question. Did the store reach out, grab your mind, and force you to stop? No. Something inside you responded. Maybe you've been thinking about buying a suit. Maybe you've been wanting a new pair of shoes. Maybe the display reminded you of who you want to become. Whatever happened, the store didn't create the driver. It matched one. Now watch how quickly your psychology begins reorganizing itself. Your attention narrows. The conversations around you disappear. Your eyes begin scanning for details. Your imagination quietly asks, what would I look like wearing that? Could I afford it? Should I go inside? Notice what just happened. The match didn't only influence what you looked at, it influenced what you thought about. Then it influenced what you felt. Then it began influencing what you wanted to do. Attention, thought, emotion, behavior. One match. 4 psychological systems moving together. That isn't weakness. That's organization. Now let's move that exact same process into relationships. You weren't looking for a relationship that afternoon. You were getting coffee. Someone smiled, held the door, asked you a question, remembered your name the next time they saw you. Most people say, that's when I started liking them. Was it? Or was that simply the first moment you became conscious of what your psychology had already begun organizing? Because here's what I want you to begin seeing. Human drivers don't wait for your permission. They begin organizing your experience immediately. Then your conscious mind arrives a few moments later, trying to explain what has already begun. That's why people often say, I don't know what happened. Exactly. Because the process started before they knew a process had begun. Now here's the discovery. Most people believe they think first, feel second, and act third. Psychologically, that's often backwards. A human driver is matched. Your nervous system responds. Your attention reorganizes. Your emotions begin shifting. Then your thinking starts explaining why. That explanation feels like the beginning. It isn't. It's the narrator arriving after the first chapter has already been written. That realization alone should change how you observe yourself for the rest of your life. Because from this point forward, every time something suddenly feels important, instead of immediately asking, why do I want this? You'll begin asking, what human driver just became active? That question gives you something extraordinary. Time. A small space between activation and action. And inside that space, agency begins to return. Your thoughts don't always begin your decisions. Sometimes your human drivers begin the process. And your thoughts simply explain the direction they've already started moving. Now, Let's make one of the most important distinctions in this entire masterclass. Not every human driver develops the same way. Some are part of being human. Others become organized through living. If you don't separate those two, you'll spend years trying to fix something that was never broken. Let's start with the first. Imagine holding your breath, not for 10 seconds, for 2 minutes, 3, 4. Eventually, your body doesn't politely ask for oxygen. It demands it. You don't negotiate with the need. You don't talk yourself out of it. You don't decide to stop wanting air. Your biology begins organizing everything around one outcome: survive. The same is true of hunger, sleep, safety, connection. Those are not evidence that something is wrong with you. They are evidence that you're human. You didn't learn to need connection. You arrived needing it. You did not learn to need safety. You arrived needing it. You did not learn to matter. You arrived with a nervous system that develops through relationships. Now, this is where people become confused. The driver is innate. The pathway is learned. There's a profound difference. Let me show you. Every child needs connection. That's innate. But not every child learns the same pathway to obtain it. One child learns, I can simply be by myself. Another learns, people only notice me when I achieve. Another learns, I have to take care of everyone else before anyone takes care of me. Another learns, if I disagree, people leave. Notice what happened. The need didn't change. The strategy did. The driver remained human. The pathway became developmental. And here's where people accidentally declare war on themselves. They say, I need to stop wanting approval. Do you? Or do you need to understand why approval became the pathway through which your psychology learned to experience significance? Those are completely different interventions. One attacks your humanity. The other updates your development. One creates shame. The other creates freedom. Now think about how many people spend decades trying to eliminate perfectly human needs instead of examining the strategies they learned to meet them. That's like blaming thirst because you kept drinking from poisoned wells. The problem wasn't that you needed water. The problem was where you learned to look for it. That one distinction has the potential to change an entire life. Because from this moment forward, I don't want you asking, what's wrong with my need? I want you asking, how did I learn to meet this need? One question creates self-condemnation. The other creates self-understanding. And self-understanding is where intentional change finally begins. Never confuse a human driver with the strategy you learn to meet it. The driver deserves compassion. The strategy deserves examination. Now, I want to show you where people's lives begin changing. Not because they met the wrong person, because they misunderstood what was happening inside themselves. Imagine someone saying, I finally found the one. What evidence are they using? Think about it. How long have they actually known this person? A week? A month? 3 months? Can you truly know another human being that quickly? Probably not. So what are they actually certain about? They're certain about their experience, not necessarily the other person. Those are two different kinds of certainty. Now stay with me. This is important. Suppose someone remembers your birthday, checks on you when you've had a difficult day, looks into your eyes while you're talking instead of looking at their phone, listens without trying to interrupt, follows through on what they promised. What begins happening inside you? You start relaxing. You begin trusting. You become more open. Your imagination begins quietly constructing a future. Now, let me ask you something. Did that person create trust, or did they activate experiences your psychology has been searching for? Because those are two completely different explanations. One says, they made me feel this way. The other says, their behavior matched something deeply meaningful inside me. The first explanation gives them your power. The second helps you understand your psychology. Now let's slow it down even more. Suppose your greatest developmental driver is being seen, not looked at, seen. Someone notices your effort, remembers something you told them 3 weeks ago, finishes a sentence you were struggling to say, understands your silence. Now something remarkable begins happening. Your nervous system relaxes. Your thoughts soften. Your body becomes calmer around them. You begin sharing things you've never told other people. People often describe this as, I finally found someone who gets me. Maybe you did. Or maybe someone finally matched one of the deepest human drivers in your psychological map. Now here's the danger. The moment that driver is matched, your brain begins making predictions. Maybe they're different. Maybe this is finally safe. Maybe this is what I've been waiting for. Do you see what just happened? Nothing about the person's character has necessarily changed. Nothing about their long-term capacity has been established. Nothing about their consistency has been proven. But because one important driver has been matched, your psychology begins filling in the blanks. This is where people accidentally move too quickly. Not because they're weak, because meaning accelerates faster than knowledge. Let me say that again. Because meaning accelerates faster than knowledge. You can feel profoundly connected to someone before you actually know them. You can imagine a future before you've observed a pattern. You can trust emotionally before trust has been demonstrated behaviorally. That isn't stupidity. That's human psychology. The problem isn't the feeling. The problem is confusing the feeling with evidence. There is a difference between what I feel and what I know. One belongs to your internal experience. The other belongs to observable reality. Psychological maturity requires both. Imagine buying a house. You walk inside. Immediately you think, I love this place. That feeling matters. But would you skip the inspection? Would you ignore the foundation? Would you refuse to ask questions because the living room made you feel at home? Of course not. Yet people do exactly that in relationships. A powerful psychological match becomes emotional proof. Questions disappear. Observation slows. Reality becomes secondary to experience. And that's where people later say, the signs were there all along. Many times they were. But the experience of having a deeply important driver met became louder than the information that contradicted it. That isn't because people become irrational. It's because motivation changes perception. When something deeply important appears available, your psychology naturally gives it greater attention. This is why awareness is so powerful. Awareness doesn't stop you from feeling. It prevents feelings from becoming the only evidence you use. The goal isn't emotional suppression. The goal is emotional integration. To let your feelings speak without allowing them to become the only voice making decisions. Because the healthiest relationships are not built by people who never feel deeply. They're built by people who allow deep feelings and equally deep observation. They remain open while remaining awake. They become vulnerable without becoming unconscious. That is emotional maturity. Never confuse a powerful psychological experience with complete knowledge of another person. Feel deeply, observe carefully. Let both grow together. Now, I want to introduce an idea that may explain decades of your life. Not every part of your psychological map carries the same weight. Some areas are emotionally louder than others. I call these hotspots. Imagine looking at a weather map. Most of the country is calm. Then there's one area flashing red. Everything begins organizing around that location. Your psychological map works in a remarkably similar way. There are certain human drivers, because of your development, that carry extraordinary emotional significance. For one person, being admired is pleasant. For another, being admired feels like finally existing. One person hears, "I'm proud of you," and smiles. Another hears the exact same sentence and fights back tears. Not because they're more emotional, because those words landed on a psychological hotspot. Another person receives a compliment and says, "Thank you." Someone else thinks about that compliment for 3 days. Same compliment, different map, different organization, different meaning. Now, let's expose something most people never notice. Imagine two women, both begin dating the same kind of man. He compliments both of them. One appreciates it. The other becomes deeply attached. Why? Because the compliment wasn't operating on empty ground. It landed on years of development, years of questions, years of adaptation, years of searching. The compliment wasn't simply heard, it was absorbed. Now reverse it. Imagine someone whose hotspot is emotional safety. Another person's appearance may not immediately matter. Their consistency does. Predictability captures attention. Reliability becomes attractive. Steadiness feels beautiful. Why? Because different hotspots organize different forms of attraction. That's why people keep arguing over what attraction is. They're describing different maps. One person says confidence is attractive. Another says kindness is attractive. Another says intelligence is attractive. They're all describing the places where their own maps become activated. None of them are describing a universal law. They're describing their organization. Now, here's the discovery that changes everything. You don't consciously decide which hotspots become emotionally powerful. Development does. Experience does. Meaning does. But awareness allows you to consciously understand them. That's where your freedom begins. Because once you know your hotspots, you stop being surprised every time someone accidentally touches one. Instead of saying, "I don't know why I reacted so strongly," you begin saying, "I know exactly which human driver just became active." That's a completely different life. Your strongest emotional reactions often reveal your psychological hotspots. Don't judge them, study them. Because what you understand, you can begin leading intentionally. This may be one of the biggest misunderstandings people have about relationships. People say, "They made me let my guard down. There was just something about them. I don't know why I trusted them so quickly." I understand why people say that, but I don't think that's what actually happened. The person did not lower your defenses. The person became the entry point. There is a difference. Imagine someone walks into your house. They ring the doorbell. You decide to open the door. Did the doorbell open the door? No. The doorbell created an opportunity. You opened it psychologically. Relationships work in a remarkably similar way. The physical aesthetic may be the first knock on the door. Their smile, their eyes, their confidence, their voice, their presence. That may be enough to make you curious. But curiosity isn't vulnerability. Curiosity simply opens the possibility for something deeper. Now, the real matching begins. They ask a question nobody has ever asked you. They remember something you forgot you told them. They notice the effort behind your success instead of only celebrating the success itself. They understand what you meant instead of only hearing what you said. Every one of those experiences is another knock, another opportunity, another possible match. Now imagine your psychological map. Not every area has the same emotional value. Some places carry extraordinary significance. Remember our hotspots. Those are the places where your development organized powerful meaning. Now imagine one of those hotspots finally gets matched. The person doesn't simply compliment you. They touch a place that has quietly been asking for recognition for years. They don't simply spend time with you. They touch a place that has been longing to feel chosen. They don't simply reassure you. They touch a place that has spent years wondering whether anyone would ever stay. Now, your experience begins changing. Your breathing slows. Your body relaxes. Your thinking becomes more optimistic. Hope quietly enters the room. Your imagination begins creating a future. Notice what happened. Your defenses didn't disappear because someone was attractive. Your defenses changed because something psychologically meaningful finally felt possible. That distinction matters. Because if you believe the person possesses magical qualities, you spend your life looking for magical people. But if you understand that the person matched something inside your psychological organization, your attention shifts. Now you begin investigating yourself instead of worshiping them. That changes relationships forever. Because now you are no longer asking, what is so special about them? You're asking, what became so meaningful inside me? That question returns your attention to the only place you actually have the power to understand, your own psychology. Now, let's go one step further. Suppose two people meet the exact same individual. One becomes deeply attached. The other remains emotionally neutral. Did the person lower one person's defenses but not the others? Or did they match one psychological map while leaving the other relatively untouched? Do you see how different those explanations are? One explanation gives the person extraordinary power. The other explains the extraordinary organization already existing within each human being. That doesn't make the experience less beautiful. It makes it understandable. And understanding creates freedom. People don't lower your defenses by simply existing. They become the opportunity through which your psychological map may begin opening. Know your map before you decide how wide to open the door. Now, I want to challenge another belief that almost everyone accepts without question. People say, I was attracted to them first. I don't think that's what happened. I think attraction is often the consequence of human drivers being matched. Let's expose it. Imagine you're reading a book. At first, it's just words on a page. Then one sentence describes something you've lived your entire life, but have never been able to explain. You stop reading. You read the sentence again. You feel understood, maybe even emotional. Now ask yourself, were you attracted to the sentence, or were you attracted to what the sentence awakened inside you? That's a completely different question. The sentence became significant because it matched your psychological experience. Now, move that exact process into relationships. Someone asked a question. Someone remembers something important to you. Someone notices a struggle you've been hiding. Someone says, I know exactly what you mean. Something shifts. Not because words are magical, because your psychology experienced recognition. Recognition becomes significance. Significance becomes emotional investment. Emotional investment begins changing attention. Attention begins changing behavior. Behavior creates proximity. Proximity creates more opportunities for matching. The cycle builds. Then one day you wake up and say, I'm attracted to them. Were you? Or was attraction the result of dozens of meaningful psychological matches accumulating over time? Do you see why this matters? Because if attraction is the consequence, you stop treating it like unexplained chemistry. Now you can investigate it. Now you can understand it. Now you can lead it. This also explains something most people have experienced but couldn't explain. Have you ever met someone you were not initially attracted to, and 6 months later couldn't imagine not being attracted to them? What changed? Their face? Usually not. Their height? No. Their voice? Probably not. Meaning changed. Your psychological map became increasingly matched. The person became increasingly significant. Attraction followed. Now let's reverse it. Have you ever been incredibly attracted to someone, then gradually lost all attraction? What happened? Did their face suddenly change? No. Reality changed meaning. You discovered dishonesty, selfishness, manipulation, cruelty, emotional unavailability. The same face now carried completely different psychological meaning. Attraction changed because meaning changed. That alone dismantles the myth that attraction is fixed. Attraction isn't simply about appearance. Appearance may open the conversation. Meaning decides whether the conversation continues. This is why I say people are attracted to individuals, but what keeps them connected is meaning. Without shared meaning, attraction eventually runs out of places to grow. Without mutual reality, the relationship slowly begins living off memories of what the match once felt like. That's why people often say, I miss how things used to be. Sometimes they aren't missing the person. They're missing the psychological experience the person once made possible. Those are not the same loss. One is grieving a human being. The other is grieving access to a human driver that once felt beautifully alive. Understanding the difference may completely change how you feel. People are attracted to people, but they remain connected through meaning. Protect your meaning, because your meaning will often determine the direction of your relationships before you consciously realize you're moving. I'm about to say something that some people will disagree with immediately, and that's okay. Stay with me though. Don't decide whether you agree until we have walked all the way through it together. I don't believe people fall in love. In fact, I think you have a better chance of falling off the Empire State Building and surviving than falling in love. Because love isn't something you accidentally fall into. Love is something two people intentionally grow into. Those are two completely different psychological processes. Now, before you reject that, let's expose what most people actually mean when they say, I fell in love. Think about the beginning of almost every relationship you've ever had. You couldn't stop thinking about the person. You wanted to be around them. You smiled when they text. You replayed conversations in your mind. You imagined the future. You felt excited, hopeful, alive. Then one day you looked at them and said, I love you. Now, let me ask you something. What exactly did you love? Think carefully. Did you love the person or did you love your experience of the person? Those are not the same thing. At that point, you probably hadn't seen them under sustained disappointment. You hadn't watched them navigate years of adversity. You hadn't witnessed how they carried responsibility over time. You hadn't experienced every version of who they could become. So what exactly had you come to know deeply enough to love? This is where I think language begins misleading us. We use one word, love, to describe several completely different psychological experiences. Sometimes we mean attraction, sometimes desire, sometimes attachment, sometimes hope, sometimes projection, sometimes genuine love. Those are not interchangeable. Imagine someone walking into a beautiful house. They stand in the living room and say, I love this house. Do they? Or do they love what they currently know about the house? There's a difference. They haven't inspected the foundation. They haven't lived through the winter inside it. They haven't discovered what breaks after 6 months. They haven't learned how the house behaves over time. They love their present experience. Real love develops as reality becomes increasingly known. Relationships are remarkably similar. In the beginning, you don't know the entire person. You know moments, experiences, conversations, possibilities. Your psychology begins organizing those experiences into meaning. That meaning becomes increasingly beautiful. The more your human drivers are matched, the more emotionally significant the person becomes. Now, your imagination quietly begins helping. It fills in gaps. It predicts futures. It assumes consistency. It creates possibilities that reality hasn't yet confirmed. Not because you're irrational, because the human mind naturally completes incomplete pictures. We all do it. Now, here's the discovery. I don't think people initially fall in love with another human being. I think they often fall in love with the psychological world that begins existing inside them when enough of their human drivers are being met. Let me say that again. I think they often fall in love with the psychological world that begins existing inside them when enough of their human drivers are being met. Because if that's true, everything changes. You don't simply love them. You love feeling understood. You love feeling chosen. You love feeling emotionally safe. You love feeling admired. You love feeling significant. You love becoming someone different in their presence. Those experiences are real. They're powerful. They're beautiful. But they are still your experiences. The other person has become associated with access to them. That's why losing someone can feel like losing yourself. Because you aren't only grieving the relationship, you're grieving access to the psychological experiences that relationship had awakened. Now let's go even deeper. This is one of the most important ideas I've ever taught. I think when people say, I love you, what they are unconsciously communicating is, I love the psychological map that keeps getting matched when I'm with you. That statement is not cynical, it's developmental. Because the map is real, the feelings are real, the attachment is real, but the relationship is still growing towards something much deeper. Love begins where projection slowly dies. Think about that. In the beginning, your imagination helps complete the picture. As time passes, reality slowly replaces imagination. You begin seeing strengths you never knew existed. You also begin seeing limitations you never imagined. The fantasy begins disappearing. Now a decision appears. Will I continue loving the real person? Or was I only attached to the experience my psychology created in the beginning? That question separates attraction from love. Attraction asks, how do you make me feel? Love eventually asks, now that I know more of who you actually are, am I still willing to intentionally build a life with you? Those are profoundly different questions. Love isn't sustained by intensity. It's sustained by reality, by honesty, by repair, by responsibility, by mutual growth, by repeatedly choosing each other after both people have become increasingly known. That is why I don't believe you fall into love. You grow into it. You build it. You practice it. You protect it. And here's why this matters. If you mistake attraction for love, you'll expect intensity to carry a relationship. Intensity can't do that. If you mistake projection for love, you'll become disappointed every time reality arrives. Reality isn't destroying love. Reality is introducing you to the person you've actually been building a relationship with. And if that relationship continues growing through truth, through conflict, through change, through disappointment, through forgiveness, through responsibility, then something extraordinary begins happening. You're no longer loving the map. You're increasingly loving the human being. It's a completely different kind of relationship. One is organized around psychological matching. The other is organized around mutual reality. One begins quickly. The other grows deliberately. One is exciting. The other becomes trustworthy. The healthiest relationships actually contain both. The psychological match may open the door. Love is what two emotionally responsible people build after they walk through it. Don't ask, when did I fall in love? Ask, am I loving the person, or am I still loving the psychological experience my map created around them? Because attraction may begin the relationship. Only reality can determine whether love has actually begun. Every painful relationship leaves something behind. Sometimes it leaves wisdom. Sometimes it leaves fear. Sometimes it leaves a conclusion. I'll never trust again. I'll never need anyone again. I'll never let somebody get that close. I'll never be that vulnerable again. Listen carefully. Those statements sound powerful. They also reveal something else. You're no longer trying to understand your humanity. You're trying to eliminate it. That's one of the greatest tragedies I see. People begin treating perfectly human experiences like psychological defects. The desire to belong becomes weakness. The desire to be loved becomes dependency. The desire to be chosen becomes embarrassment. The desire to understand becomes something to hide. None of those things are evidence that something is wrong with you. They're evidence that you're human. The problem isn't that you have wants. The problem isn't that you have needs. The problem isn't that you have desires. The problem isn't that somewhere in your development, those perfectly human drivers became connected to strategies that no longer serve you. There's a difference. A child who repeatedly feels invisible may learn, if I become exceptional, someone will finally notice me. Years later, the adult says, I don't need recognition. Really? Or have you simply become exhausted chasing it? Another person grows up believing, if I keep everyone happy, they won't love me. If I keep everyone happy, they won't leave. Years later, they say, I don't need people. Really? Or did your psychology become so tired of disappointment that distance began feeling safer than desire? Those are not the same thing. One is healing. The other is surrender. This is where many people accidentally declare war on themselves. They stop answering phone calls. They stop opening up. They stop trusting. They stop hoping. Then they call it growth. Growth doesn't require becoming less human. Growth requires becoming more conscious of your humanity. Those are profoundly different paths. One builds walls, the other builds wisdom. One suppresses, the other understands. One creates isolation, the other creates intentionality. Look at what happens after heartbreak. A person says, I'll never love again. Another says, I'll never date again. Another says, I'm happier by myself. Maybe, but sometimes those statements aren't describing freedom. They're describing adaptation. The nervous system has quietly concluded, if I stop wanting, I can't be disappointed. That sounds logical until you realize disappointment wasn't the original problem. The original problem was never wanting. The original problem was not understanding what was organizing the wanting. You cannot solve loneliness by becoming emotionally unavailable. You cannot solve disappointment by refusing to hope. You cannot solve betrayal by refusing intimacy. Those solutions don't resolve the human driver. They simply disconnect you from it. The driver doesn't disappear. It waits. It waits until someone accidentally touches it again. Then people become confused. I don't know what happened. I promised myself I wouldn't do this again. Of course you did. You made a promise to your behavior. You never investigated your psychology. Behavior follows drivers. Drivers organize behavior. If the driver remains unchanged, the old strategy patiently waits for another opportunity. That's why the pattern returns. Not because you lacked discipline, not because you weren't intelligent, because you tried to silence your humanity instead of understanding it. That may be one of the greatest psychological mistakes a person can make. You are trying to defend yourself against being human. And humanity has never been your enemy. Ignorance has, unconsciousness has, misunderstanding has. Your humanity has been trying to communicate with you your entire life. Every want, every need, every desire has been asking the same question. Will you finally understand why I exist? The answer is not to eliminate the driver. The answer is to understand it so clearly that it no longer has to secretly direct your life. That is where freedom begins, not when you stop feeling. When you stop being unconsciously led by what you feel. Never confuse your humanity with your history. Your humanity gave you the driver. Your history taught you the strategy. You don't need to become less human. You need to become more intentional about how you honor your humanity. Most people know what they feel. Very few people know what they're wanting. Those are not the same thing. I feel anxious. Good. Why? I don't know. Exactly. The feeling is real. The driver the driver remains hidden. Suppose someone doesn't return your text message. Your anxiety begins increasing. Your mind immediately starts producing explanations. They're losing interest. I said something wrong? They're probably talking to someone else. You experience the thoughts. You experience the anxiety. You may even experience your body becoming restless. But none of those experiences answer the most important question. What human driver just became active? Is it reassurance, significance, certainty, belonging, connection? Until you know the driver, you'll spend your life trying to regulate the emotion, instead of understanding what the emotion has been trying to tell you. Emotions are not random. Emotions are often reporting on the status of something psychologically important. The emotion is not the destination. The emotion is information. Most people stop at the feeling. Growth asks another question. What is this feeling trying to protect, preserve, or obtain? That question changes everything. Because the moment you identify the driver, your relationship with the emotion begins changing. You're no longer drowning inside it. You're studying it. A person says, I get jealous. Do they? Or does the possibility of losing something psychologically meaningful activate a driver they've never consciously understood? Another person says, I'm too needy. Are they? Or have they spent years confusing a perfectly human need for connection with the developmental strategy they learned to obtain it? Another person says, I overthink everything. Maybe. Or maybe uncertainty repeatedly activates a psychological driver that desperately wants safety before moving forward. Do you hear the difference? One explanation judges the person. The other investigates the process. Grow Yourself Great has never been about asking what's wrong with you. It's always been about asking, what is your psychology trying to accomplish? Because behavior always serves a function, always healthy, unhealthy, adaptive, maladaptive. Every behavior is trying to accomplish something. The question isn't whether it has a purpose. The question is whether the purpose still deserves the strategy. That is where change begins. A child who learns, if I make everyone happy, people stay, becomes an adult who cannot say no. The people pleasing isn't random, it's organized. The behavior makes sense. The strategy worked until it didn't. Another child learns, if I don't need anybody, nobody can hurt me. The independence isn't random, it's organized. The strategy protected them until it began isolating them. This is why I refuse to shame adaptation. Adaptation is evidence of intelligence. Your brain solved the problem it understood. The question is, does the solution still fit the life you're trying to build? That's a very different conversation than asking, what's wrong with me? Nothing may be wrong with you. Something may simply be outdated. And outdated strategies continue producing outdated lives. This is where awareness becomes one of the greatest forms of psychological power. Because once you know your drivers, you begin recognizing them before they quietly organize your behavior. You notice yourself becoming unusually attached. You notice yourself becoming unusually fearful. You notice yourself becoming unusually reactive. Instead of immediately believing every thought, you pause. Something important just happened, not outside you, inside you. A driver became active. Now you become curious instead of critical. What is my psychology trying to obtain? What am I afraid of losing? What am I hoping will happen? What meaning am I assigning that hasn't actually been demonstrated yet? Those questions don't weaken emotion, they organize it. You don't become less human. You become more conscious while being human. That is emotional maturity, not the absence of emotion, the presence of awareness. If you cannot name the driver will quietly name your direction. Learn to identify what your psychology is pursuing before your behavior begins pursuing it for you. Something remarkable happens when a human driver is finally matched. Not because the world changes, because your internal world does. Suppose one of your strongest developmental drivers is being understood, not agreed with, understood. You've spent years trying to explain yourself, correcting misunderstandings, feeling unseen, feeling like people hear your words without hearing you. Then someone says, I know exactly what you mean. Not politely, accurately. They understand the experience behind your words. Immediately, your body changes. You didn't tell it to. Your breathing becomes easier. The tension in your shoulders softens. Your face relaxes. Hope quietly enters your nervous system. Then your thoughts begin changing. They really get me. I've never experienced this before. I don't have to explain myself. Then your emotions begin changing. You feel safer, closer, more connected. Then your behavior begins changing. You disclose more. You trust more. You become more available. Do you see the progression? The driver was matched. The nervous system responded. Thoughts reorganized. Emotions reorganized. Behavior reorganized. Most people only notice the behavior. Psychology began long before the behavior appeared. Now let's expose something almost nobody notices. The matched driver begins influencing perception. You start paying greater attention to confirming experiences. You remember the thoughtful things they do. You explain away the inconsistent things they do. Not because you're foolish, because human beings naturally move toward experiences that appear to satisfy psychologically meaningful outcomes. That is why motivation works. The danger isn't having the driver. The danger is forgetting that the driver is active. Because when you forget it's active, you begin mistaking activation for evidence. That distinction may protect years of your life. A matched driver tells something important is happening inside you. It does not tell you everything you need to know about the person standing in front of you. Those are two different investigations. One is internal, the other is relational. Healthy relationships require both. When a driver is met, don't only observe the other person, observe what begins changing inside you. Your psychology will often reveal more than the relationship at that moment. If understanding yourself when a driver is met gives you awareness, understanding yourself when it isn't met gives you freedom. This is where most people stop paying attention. Not because nothing is happening, because everything is happening. The driver isn't being satisfied. The mind begins searching. The nervous system begins anticipating. The body begins preparing. Then people say, I don't know why I reacted like that. Let's slow the moment down. You send a message, hours pass, nothing. The phone is silent. You tell yourself, I'm fine. Then you check your phone again. 5 minutes later, you check it again. Then you begin remembering the last conversation. Did I say something wrong? Maybe they're upset. Maybe they're losing interest. Notice what just happened. The silence didn't create those thoughts. The silence activated something. The driver was not being met. The mind immediately began trying to solve the disconnection. Now another person experiences the exact same silence. They think they're probably busy. Then they continue living their day. Same silence, different psychology. What changed? Not the phone, not the amount of time, not the relationship. The map. One person's map connected silence with uncertainty. Another person's map did not. One person's driver demanded immediate organization. The other person's did not. That is why people can live through the exact same event while inhabiting completely different emotional worlds. Suppose your strongest developmental driver is reassurance. Not because reassurance is inherently unhealthy, because somewhere in your development, reassurance became the pathway through which your nervous system learned everything is okay. Now, reassurance disappears. Your body doesn't simply notice, it responds. Your thoughts begin accelerating. Your emotions intensify. Your attention narrows. Every piece of information suddenly seems important. The driver isn't quietly waiting, it's organizing. This is why I keep saying behavior begins long before behavior appears. The argument didn't begin when you raised your voice. It began when the driver became threatened. The withdrawal didn't begin when you walked away. It began when another driver concluded, I need distance to protect myself. The people pleasing didn't begin when you said yes. It began when another driver whispered, if you disappoint them, you might lose them. By the time behavior becomes visible, your psychology has already been working. This is where many people accidentally become afraid of their emotions. They think, if I feel this strongly, something must be wrong with me. No. Something important may simply not be happening. Those are very different conclusions. If the driver is connection, disconnection will matter. If the driver is certainty, uncertainty will matter. If the driver is significance, feeling overlooked will matter. The feeling isn't proving you're broken. The feeling is reporting that something psychologically meaningful is currently absent. Now comes the question that separates reaction from growth. How do you respond when the driver isn't being met? Now, what do you feel? What do you do? Do you become louder? Do you become quieter? Do you pursue? Do you withdraw? Do you over-explain? Do you disappear? Do you become controlling? Do you become emotionally unavailable before someone else has the opportunity to leave? Those behaviors aren't random. They're attempts to restore something psychologically important. The behavior is trying to solve a problem. The question is, does it actually solve it? Or does it accidentally create the very outcome you were hoping to avoid? The person who fears abandonment begins demanding reassurance. The reassurance becomes exhausting. The relationship becomes strained. The fear of abandonment quietly creates the conditions that make abandonment more likely. Not because the person wanted to lose the relationship, because the strategy had never been examined. Another person fears being controlled. They withdraw every time intimacy deepens. Their partner feels rejected. The relationship weakens. Then they conclude, see, people always leave. No. People may have been responding to a strategy that was protecting an old driver while unintentionally damaging the present relationship. That is one of the cruelest realities of unconscious adaptation. The strategy originally developed to protect the driver can eventually become the greatest obstacle to having the driver met. Let me say that again. The strategy originally developed to protect the driver can eventually become the greatest obstacle to having the driver met. Because that sentence explains decades of some people's lives. The strategy that once protected you may now be preventing you from experiencing exactly what you've always wanted. This is where tolerance becomes one of the most powerful psychological skills you can ever develop. Can you tolerate uncertainty without forcing certainty? Can you tolerate not feeling chosen without auditioning for worth? Can you tolerate loneliness without attaching yourself to the first person who temporarily quiets it? Can you tolerate disappointment without deciding hope was the mistake? That is emotional development. Not becoming numb, becoming capable. Because the moment you can remain present while a driver is not being met, you create something that did not previously exist: space. And inside that space, you regain the ability to choose, not because the driver disappeared, because the driver is no longer making every decision for you. That is self-agency, not controlling your feelings, leading yourself while feeling them. Don't only study yourself when a driver is met. Study yourself when it isn't, because unmet drivers often reveal more about your psychology than fulfilled ones ever could. And once you understand how you respond to an unmet driver, you can begin developing strategies that build the life you actually want. Instead of repeatedly protecting the life you once had to survive. Have you ever promised yourself, "I'm not doing this again"? Then 6 months later, you found yourself doing exactly what you promised you wouldn't do? You weren't looking for another emotionally unavailable person, yet somehow, there you were. You weren't looking for another relationship where you had to earn love, yet somehow, there you were. You weren't looking for another situation where you abandoned yourself trying to keep someone else, yet somehow, there you were. People usually explain that by saying, "I never learned." I don't believe that. I think something much more interesting happened. The mind that made the promise wasn't the same mind that later made the decision. Remember something we've discussed before? You have one brain, not one mind. One brain capable of organizing multiple minds. Each mind carries its own history, its own expectations, its own emotional memories, its own conclusions, its own human drivers. And whichever mind has the strongest emotional connection to the present experience often climbs onto the throne. Notice I didn't say the smartest mind. I didn't say the most mature mind. I didn't say the most logical mind. I said the one with the strongest emotional organization around what is happening. That distinction changes everything. Suppose one part of you learned people always leave. That mind became organized around protection. It watches carefully, questions motives, looks for inconsistency. Another part of you learned connection is worth the risk. That mind moves toward people, opens, believes, hopes. Now someone enters your life. They begin matching important human drivers. Which mind do you think becomes louder? The hopeful one? The protective one? The answer depends on your development, not your intelligence, your development. That's why two equally intelligent people can make completely different relational decisions. Different minds, organized by different histories, are responding to the same event. This explains something people often criticize about themselves. Part of me knew better. Exactly. Part of you did. Another part of you wanted something else. Do you see why I refuse to reduce people to contradictions? You're not necessarily inconsistent. You may be internally organized. Different minds, different drivers, different priorities, competing for leadership. The problem isn't that they exist. The problem is when one mind quietly takes the throne without the rest of the community of self-participation. That's when people wake up months later saying, I don't even know what I was thinking. You were thinking, just not from the place you believe was leading. Think about someone recovering from a painful relationship. One mind says, take your time. Another says, what if nobody else ever loves you? One says, observe their behavior. Another says, don't lose this opportunity. One says, you've grown. Another says, don't end up alone. All of those voices may belong to the same person. The question isn't which one is real. They're all real. The question is, which one is sitting on the throne? Because the mind sitting on the throne organizes attention. It interprets behavior. It assigns meaning. It influences emotion. It begins directing behavior. This is why self-awareness is not simply becoming conscious of your thoughts. It's becoming conscious of who inside you is doing the thinking. That may be one of the most important distinctions in all of Grow Yourself Great. Growth is not achieved by humiliating the mind that becomes activated. That mind developed for a reason. It protected something. It preserved something. It solved something. The goal isn't to exile it. The goal is to understand it. Then invite the rest of the community of self into the conversation. The mind longing for connection deserves to be heard. The mind recognizing inconsistency deserves to be heard. The mind protecting dignity deserves to be heard. The mind imagining a future deserves to be heard. Then something remarkable happens. No single activated mind has to carry the weight of your entire life. The community begins leading together. That's integration. Integration is an agreement. Integration is leadership. The throne no longer belongs to whichever mind is emotionally loudest. It belongs to the self capable of hearing them all. That is psychological maturity, not eliminating parts of yourself, learning how to lead all of them. The goal isn't to silence the mind that becomes activated. The goal is to make sure it isn't making lifelong decisions by itself. Because whichever mind sits on the throne will organize the direction of your life until another mind is capable of leading with greater awareness. One of the most painful sentences people ever speak is this: they made me feel alive. Did they? Or did they help you experience something that was already possible within you? There's a profound difference, because if they created it, they own it. If they awakened it, it still belongs to you. Think about that. Someone says, they made me feel beautiful. Did they create your beauty, or did they recognize something that already existed? Someone says, they made me feel confident. Did they manufacture confidence, or did their attention temporarily make it easier for you to access a part of yourself that had always been there? Someone says, they made me feel worthy. No, your worth did not enter your life the day they did. Their presence may have become a pathway through which your psychology finally experienced it. Those are not the same thing. This is where people quietly surrender enormous amounts of personal power. They begin believing another human being owns experiences that have always belonged to their humanity. Hope, joy, connection, desire, confidence, belonging, meaning, love. The person became associated with those experiences. But association is not ownership. Association is not ownership. The relationship may have been the road. It was never the destination. When the relationship ends, people often feel like they have lost themselves. I understand why. The pathway disappeared. The experiences became harder to access. The nervous system immediately concludes, part of me is gone. No, part of you became harder to reach. There's hope in that difference. Because if something is gone, there's nothing left to build. If something has become difficult to access, a new pathway can be developed. That's exactly what healing is. Healing is not convincing yourself you never needed the relationship. Healing is discovering that the experiences you associated with one person can gradually become available through healthier pathways, including the relationship you develop with yourself. That doesn't diminish love, it deepens it. Because now you stop asking another person to become the sole source of experiences that no human being was designed to carry alone. You begin building a life where your humanity has more than one pathway to belonging, more than one pathway to purpose, more than one pathway to joy, more than one pathway to meaning. That's freedom. Not because people stop mattering, because one person no longer has to become your entire psychological ecosystem. Never give another person ownership of experiences that belong to your humanity. They may awaken them, they may nurture them, they may celebrate them, but they never become the owner of what has always been yours. Most people begin growth by asking the wrong question. How do I stop wanting this? How do I stop needing people? How do I stop caring so much? I understand the question. Pain always makes us want distance from whatever seems to have created it. Touch a hot stove, you don't become curious, you pull your hand away. Psychologically, people often do the same thing. A relationship hurts, trust becomes the enemy. Vulnerability becomes the enemy. Hope becomes the enemy. Need becomes the enemy. Humanity becomes the enemy. But notice what quietly happened. You stopped trying to understand the driver and started trying to eliminate it. You cannot eliminate something that is part of being human. You cannot suppress it, distract yourself from it, deny it, intellectualize it. Keep yourself so busy that you don't have to hear it. But eventually, life becomes quiet, and there it is. Still waiting, still asking for understanding. Not because your humanity is stubborn, because your humanity has been trying to tell you something all along. Think about hunger. Suppose someone repeatedly eats unhealthy food. Eventually, they become sick. Would you tell them the problem is hunger? Of course not. Hunger wasn't the problem. The pathway was. The strategy was. The relationship with the driver was. Now replace hunger with belonging. Replace food with emotionally available people. Do you see it? The need for belonging isn't creating the suffering. The repeated pathway toward belonging may be. That distinction changes the entire conversation. Because once you stop blaming the driver, you become curious about the strategy. Curiosity creates options. Shame creates repetition. A person says, I always chase emotionally unavailable people. I don't begin by asking, why do you keep chasing them? I ask, what human driver keeps becoming active in those relationships? What does emotional unavailability allow your psychology to experience? Hope, challenge, purpose, the opportunity to finally earn love, the chance to repair something development never completed. Because every repeated pattern is solving something, even when it creates suffering. Until you understand what problem the pattern has been trying to solve, you'll continue trying to eliminate the pattern without replacing its function. And functions don't disappear, they get replaced. That is one of the most important principles in psychology. You don't simply stop doing something. You discover a healthier way of accomplishing what the old strategy was trying to accomplish. Suppose someone's driver is significance. Their entire life, they've become significant by rescuing people. They're always available, always sacrificing, always fixing, always carrying everyone else's emotional weight. Eventually, they're exhausted. Someone tells them, stop rescuing people. Good advice. Incomplete intervention. Because if rescuing disappears, how does significance happen now? You remove the strategy. You never develop the alternative. Eventually, the old strategy quietly returns, not because they didn't want to change, because significance still matters. The driver was never addressed. Growth is not subtraction. Growth is replacement. You replace unconscious strategies with intentional ones. You replace automatic reactions with deliberate responses. You replace borrowed identities with constructed identities. You replace survival with leadership. That is grow yourself great, not becoming someone else, leading yourself more consciously than you did yesterday. Don't ask, how do I stop needing? Ask, how can I meet this human driver in a healthier, more intentional way? Because healing doesn't eliminate humanity. It teaches your humanity new pathways. Every human driver creates energy. Energy is not the problem. Direction is. Imagine sitting behind the steering wheel of a powerful car. The engine starts. The vehicle has tremendous horsepower. Is the horsepower dangerous? No. Direction determines whether the same power builds your future or destroys it. Human drivers work the same way. The driver creates psychological energy. The question becomes, who is directing it? Most people think self-control is the answer. I don't. Because self-control often sounds like suppression. Hold it in. Ignore it. Fight it. Push it down. Eventually, what you've been fighting becomes stronger than the part doing the fighting. That isn't agency. That's exhaustion. Self-agency is different. Self-agency doesn't ask, how do I stop feeling this? Self-agency asks, knowing exactly what I'm feeling, how do I intend to move? That one question changes everything. Suppose rejection activates your need for significance. Reaction immediately begins looking outside yourself. Who rejected me? Why? How do I get them back? How do I prove my value? Agency pauses, not because rejection doesn't hurt, because the direction still belongs to you. Agency says, something inside me has become active. Before I decide what to do about them, I'm going to understand what's happening within me. Pause is one of the greatest expressions of psychological freedom. Not because it removes emotion, because it prevents emotion from becoming your only leader. Every day, human drivers become active. Somebody ignores you. Somebody compliments you. Somebody disappoints you. Somebody chooses you. Somebody leaves. Somebody stays. Activation is inevitable. Reaction is automatic. Agency is intentional. Let me say that again. Activation is inevitable. Reaction is automatic. Agency is intentional. The goal isn't to stop activation. The goal is to become increasingly intentional after activation occurs. That is a completely different way of living. Instead of spending your life trying to prevent emotional experiences, you develop the capacity to lead yourself through them. That is resilience, not emotional numbness. Psychological leadership. When you become self-agentic, something remarkable begins happening. Your relationships become choices instead of emotional emergencies. Your boundaries become expressions of clarity instead of punishment. Your vulnerability becomes intentional instead of impulsive. You stop asking, how do I stop attracting these people? You begin asking, what kind of person am I becoming every time one of my human drivers becomes active? That question reaches far beyond relationships. It reaches identity because every repeated response is constructing someone. Every repeated decision is rehearsing someone. Every repeated strategy is building someone. The question has never only been, who am I attracted to? The deeper question has always been, who am I becoming while responding to what attracts me? That's identity construction. Not something that happens to you, something you participate in every single day. Human drivers create energy. Self-agency gives that energy direction. Your future will not be determined by what you feel. It will be profoundly influenced by who repeatedly leads you after you feel it. Everything we've discussed up to this point leads here. Not because this is the end of the conversation, because this is where understanding becomes transformation. Information doesn't change lives. Organization does. You can understand every word I've said today and still repeat the same pattern next month. Not because the information was wrong, because insight by itself rarely reorganizes a life. A life changes when understanding becomes repeated practice. That is why Grow Yourself Great has never been about collecting psychological concepts. It's about constructing a different way of living. The 8 GYG elements aren't 8 separate ideas. They're 8 ways of leading yourself after a human driver becomes active. Let's walk through them. Family. First and most importantly, love yourself. That's what family stands for. Every human driver has a history. Not because your family is responsible for every decision you've ever made, but because development happens in relationship. Before you knew what confidence was, someone was teaching you what confidence felt like. Before you knew what belonging was, someone was teaching you what belonging required. Before you knew what love was, someone was teaching you what love looked like. Sometimes those lessons were beautiful. Sometimes they were painful. Most of the time, they were both. The goal isn't to blame your family. The goal is to understand where your map began taking shape. Because understanding the beginning allows you to stop confusing history with destiny. Your family introduced the first draft. You are responsible for every revision after that. Respect where your map began. Don't assume it has to end there. Real. Recognize every aspect of life. That's what real means. or stands for. One of the greatest dangers in relationships is confusing experience with reality. Someone smiles at you, that's reality. You conclude they must really care about me. That's interpretation. Someone forgets to call, that's reality. You conclude I'm obviously not important. That's interpretation. Human drivers don't only organize emotion, they organize meaning. That's why two people can experience the same event and tell completely different stories about it. Being real means separating what happened from what you concluded. That one practice can save years of unnecessary suffering because reality deserves your attention, not just your interpretation of it. Always ask yourself, what happened, before asking, what does this mean? IDC stands for intentional, deliberate, creative. If you don't intentionally lead your drivers, your development will. If you aren't deliberate, your adaptations will quietly make decisions for you. If you aren't creative, you'll continue believing yesterday's strategy is your only option. Suppose your driver is significant. Development taught you to become significant by sacrificing yourself. Intentionality asks, is that the life I actually want? Deliberateness asks, what behavior supports the future I'm trying to build? Creativity asks, what are 3 healthier ways I can experience significance without abandoning myself? That's growth. Not eliminating the driver, expanding the pathways. The moment your psychology believes there's only one road, you're already losing freedom. Healthy development always increases options. Trauma usually decreases them. Healing expands them again. Growth isn't finding one better strategy. Growth is creating enough healthy options that your past is no longer your only teacher. Think it, speak it, do it. Insight has to travel. It begins in your thinking. Then it enters your language. Finally, it becomes your behavior. Many people stop after understanding. They say, I know why I do it. Good. Can you say it? Can you tell someone? When communication suddenly changes, I notice my need for reassurance becomes active. That sentence sounds completely different than, why haven't you texted me? One comes from awareness. The other comes from activation. Language organizes relationships. The better you understand your psychology, the more honestly you can communicate it. Then behavior changes. Not because someone else changed you, because your understanding finally reached your actions. Thinking without behavior creates frustration. Behavior without understanding creates repetition. Growth requires both. If your awareness never reaches your words, and your words never reach your behavior, your life will continue reflecting yesterday's understanding instead of today's insight. Devotion. There is something I never wanted you to misunderstand. Insight is exciting. Transformation is repetitive. People love breakthrough moments. Very few people love participating after the breakthrough. But practice is where identity changes. The first time you recognize your driver, celebrate. The 50th time, celebrate again. Because you're teaching your nervous system something it has never experienced before. You're teaching it that awareness can remain present while activation is happening. That takes devotion, not perfection, devotion. You won't outgrow your humanity. You'll grow in your relationship with it. Don't measure growth by whether your drivers become active. Measure it by how intentionally you lead yourself after they do. Integration. You are not one feeling. You are not one thought. You are not one reaction. You're a community. One mind wants closeness. Another wants safety. Another wants certainty. Another wants adventure. They all deserve to be heard. None of them deserve to rule alone. Integration is psychological leadership. You don't silence the fearful mind. You listen to it. You don't shame the hopeful mind. You listen to it. You don't ignore the wise mind. You elevate it. Then something remarkable happens. Your decisions become larger than your activation. You stop living from whichever mind happened to become emotional first. You begin living from the community you've intentionally learned to lead. Integration doesn't eliminate your different minds. It teaches them how to move in the same direction. Trajectory. Every human driver asks a question. Every strategy answers it. The only question is, where is that answer taking you? Suppose your driver is belonging. Every time you feel disconnected, you immediately overextend yourself. You become available. You rescue. You sacrifice. It works. People appreciate you. But where does that trajectory lead? Exhaustion, resentment, emotional invisibility. The strategy solved today's discomfort. It quietly built tomorrow's suffering. Trajectories force you to stop judging a strategy by how it feels today and begin judging it by where it repeatedly takes you. That's maturity. The present matters. The future matters too. Don't ask if the strategy works. Ask where it keeps taking you. Because repeated direction eventually becomes destiny. Identity construction. This is where everything comes together. Every repeated response is constructing someone. Every repeated thought is rehearsing someone. Every repeated strategy is becoming someone. Identity isn't something you wake up and discover one morning. Identity is something you repeatedly practice. Suppose every time you feel uncertain, you abandon yourself to keep someone else. Eventually, you don't just perform that behavior. You begin believing this is who I am. No, that is who you've repeatedly practiced being. There is hope in that distinction because what has been practiced can be practiced differently. You are not trapped inside yesterday's construction. You are participating in today's. Every decision, every boundary, every conversation, every act of courage is placing another brick in the person you're becoming. That means every time a human driver becomes active, you are doing much more than responding to the feeling. You are constructing an identity. Choose carefully because eventually the person you are repeatedly practicing becomes the person you believe yourself to be. You don't become your future all at once. You rehearse it, one psychologically significant decision at a time. We begin with one question. Why do I keep falling for the same people? I don't think that was ever the real question. I think it was the safest question. Because as long as the question remains about them, you never have to investigate yourself. You can spend years studying personalities, attachment styles, red flags, compatibility, communication, and all of those things matter. But none of them answer the deeper question, what keeps becoming psychologically significant to me? That question changes everything. Because the moment you answer it, you stop chasing explanations outside yourself and begin understanding the organization inside yourself. You begin recognizing your map. You begin recognizing your drivers. You begin recognizing the mind sitting on the throne. You begin recognizing your hotspots. You begin recognizing your strategies. Most importantly, you begin recognizing your power. Not power over people, power over participation, the ability to decide. Just because something is psychologically significant doesn't mean it automatically deserves psychological access. Let me say that again. Just because something is psychologically significant doesn't mean it automatically deserves psychological access, because that sentence can change your life. Not everything that captures your attention deserves your investment. Not everything that awakens your humanity deserves your future. That distinction is called discernment. And discernment is one of the highest expressions of psychological maturity. Think about how many years people spend asking, how do I stop attracting the wrong people? Maybe that's not the question. Maybe the better question is, how do I stop giving immediate authority to every experience that successfully matches my psychological map? Those are completely different problems. One problem keeps your attention on the world. The other develops leadership within yourself. Because there will always be people capable of matching your drivers. There will always be people capable of awakening hope, curiosity, excitement, desire, connection. The goal was never to eliminate matching. The goal is to become conscious while it's happening. That changes everything. A psychologically mature person doesn't become less attracted. They become more aware. They don't become emotionally flat. They become emotionally informed. They don't become suspicious of everyone. They become deeply curious about themselves. That's a very different life. Instead of asking, why do I keep doing this? They ask, what inside me keeps making this psychologically meaningful? Curiosity replaces criticism. Understanding replaces shame. Leadership replaces reaction. That's growth. One of the greatest gifts you can ever give yourself is refusing to let your first feeling become your final conclusion. Feel it, respect it, study it, then continue learning. Because your first feeling tells you something important. It doesn't tell you everything. Time has information your emotions don't yet possess. Reality has information your imagination doesn't yet possess. Character has information attraction doesn't yet possess. Give all of them an opportunity to speak. That is how wise relationships are built. You don't need less heart. You need more awareness. You don't need fewer feelings. You need more understanding. You don't need to stop being human. You need to become a better steward of your humanity. That is a completely different mission. One day, someone is going to walk into your life. They're going to capture your attention. Something inside you is going to move. That's not the moment to become afraid. That's the moment to become aware. You'll recognize the feeling. You'll notice the activation. You'll hear your thoughts beginning to organize. You'll feel your emotions beginning to expand. You'll recognize your humanity doing exactly what human beings were designed to do. And instead of asking, what's wrong with me? You'll smile. Because you'll know what's happening. A human driver just became active. Then you'll ask better questions. What driver is being matched? What meaning am I assigning? What evidence actually exists? What has this person consistently demonstrated? Which mind is trying to take the throne? What trajectory would this pattern create if I continued it for the next 5 years? Does this relationship support the identity I'm intentionally constructing? Those questions don't kill attraction. They protect it because attraction deserves truth. Love deserves reality, and you deserve both. There was never anything wrong with the fact that you wanted to belong. There was never anything wrong with wanting to matter. There was never anything wrong with wanting someone to understand you. There was never anything wrong with wanting to love or to be loved. Those weren't your greatest vulnerabilities. Those were always your humanity. The vulnerability was never your humanity. The vulnerability was allowing your humanity to remain unconscious. Because whatever remains unconscious eventually begins leading, not because it wants to control you, because it has never been consciously led. Perhaps that's the greatest lesson of this entire masterclass. People spend years trying to find the right person. Very few people spend the same amount of time becoming the kind of person who can consciously participate in love. One pursuit changes your dating life. The other changes your life. Because the healthiest relationship you will ever build isn't the one where someone perfectly matches your psychological map. It's the one where two psychologically aware people recognize each other's humanity, respect each other's development, take responsibility for their own drivers, and intentionally build something that neither of them has to abandon themselves to maintain. That is no longer attraction. That is no longer projection. That is no longer unconscious adaptation. That is love growing up. You may have started this masterclass believing you had a type. I hope you're leaving with something much more valuable. You have a map. That map was shaped by development. Your development organized human drivers. Those drivers influence attention. Attention influences meaning. Meaning influences emotion. Emotion influences behavior. Behavior repeated over time begins constructing identity. None of that makes you broken. It makes you human. And once you understand the process, you no longer have to fear it. You can lead it. You can recognize when your humanity has become active without surrendering your future to your first feeling. You can honor your needs without becoming controlled by them. You can remain open without becoming unconscious. You can love without abandoning yourself. That is what Grow Yourself Great has always been about. Not becoming someone else. Understanding yourself so clearly that you can intentionally participate in becoming who you're capable of being. Understanding your psychology matters. It helps you understand the patterns shaping your life. Understand clearly. Integrate deeply. Grow yourself great.